Hello, everybody there in social media land. Thanks for joining us. My name is Gary Eelman,
And I'm John Berardino.
and this is The Middle for Men. On our platform, we dive into many men's issues. Women are about a third of our audience, so it seems that they're interested as well. But things are looked at mostly from a men's perspective. Our last episode, episode 8, was titled Toxic Masculinity. And we had more views and more hours watched on that than anything previously. And so we got thinking about it and why it was such a controversial topic. Makes a lot of sense. It's used almost ubiquitously now. I don't personally like the term, and I said that in the last podcast. And since then, we've given it a lot of thought. John and I have had a lot of discussion, and we think it's worth another shot. We think it's worth another podcast. And so we're going to go at that today, and I hope you enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, please subscribe to our channel at the middle for men, and you'll find that podcast of the same name. John, I'm going to turn it over to you now and let you begin with what we talked about.
Okay, well, look, I think it is a controversial topic, like you talked about, Gary. One of the areas of concern for us, both Gary and I, happen to be very emotionally aware. We would consider ourselves to be emotionally mature and intelligent because we consider access to our feeling states as being important parts of how we perceive ourselves and how we interact with other people. One of the central features that we're concerned about with toxic masculinity is the negation of emotion as being an important part of the ways in which we relate to ourselves, relate to others, and of course, identify ourselves as men. And Gary and I have had lots of conversations about this, primarily because there is a lot of talk about the toxic part of masculinity, but there's not a lot of talk about what healthy masculinity is and what it means to us as individuals. And most importantly, I think in regards to our relationships, we are relational, social beings. And if we're not in touch with our emotional states and able to think critically about the ways in which we demonstrate them, we are less effective human beings. So I just want to give context going back to our previous episode in regards to how we discussed toxic masculinity. There are the typical terms that are maybe affiliated with it, which have to do with aggression and domination and objectification of women, as we talked about. There are kind of terms that might be conflated with it that probably we want to disabuse, like stoic. I think that the ways in which it's mostly expressed is actually through a restriction of emotion, or the belief that to communicate or convey feeling is in some ways weakness. So we want to discuss that primarily to disabuse some of these ideas that we feel are problematic, and get into, I think, as Gary and I have discussed many times with each other, well, what does it mean to be a man? So I want to turn it back to you, Gary, and kind of get it back to that place where we can start to discuss, well, what does it mean to be a man, and what are we aiming for? What's the goal here if we are talking about healthy masculinity?
Sure. So the last time we spoke about this, John, I kind of flipped that question as to what it means to be a man.
Yeah,
Instead, all the things that we know or that we identify is not being a man. And
right.
certainly some of the things that we've heard from people and comments that we've heard from people about, being strong, being a warrior, Jordan Peterson's relatively recent comments about having a saber and sheathing it and until you learn to control it, building a monster. I mean, literally, he talked about men need to be monsters. You want to be an incredible monster and then harness that.
Yeah, yeah,
I just think that's personally, I think that's idiotic. Let's build AI so that it can kill us, and then we'll figure out how to tone it down so it doesn't. I mean, This doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense to me at all. So
Yeah.
it's much easier for me on a personal level to look at someone and say, that's not what it means to be a man. For example, I want to fight every chance I get. I want to be aggressive. I'm going to be nasty. I'm going to go through life. I'm not going to share my feelings. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to, because I'm a man. When I lose somebody, I'm not going to show that emotion, that
Right.
grief, that sadness, that terrible
Right.
feeling of desperation of losing somebody you love. It's completely the opposite of that for me that defines what being a man is. It's having the courage to be vulnerable that you and I have talked about
Right.
before, to open up your heart, your emotions, and to give love freely and as often and as deeply as you can, and expect no returns. This is part of what it means to be a man. And I don't understand this movement, for example, on the part of Peterson, who is a brilliant psychologist by many people's standards, and I found a lot of what he said to be interesting in the past. But to come out with this sort of thing, no, you need to be a monster. You need to be tough. And then once you're tough, then you sheathe your
Yeah.
blade and don't use it. I don't know. It sounds derailed to me.
Yeah.
It's just
I
completely derailed off the track.
I think he said you need to be ruthlessly ambitious and
Yeah.
then learn how to control it. Uh,
Yes. I don't
I, I,
understand.
I I think coming from a Jungian point of view, and I know he is inspired by Carl Jung, as am I, that is not the appropriate order. You don't allow the aggression to come out, or however he's characterizing it in regards to what he perceives as being problematic.
Yeah.
What he is essentially saying, to be weak, to be docile, to be a pacifist, to give in to that extreme in some respects, you fight it by becoming a monster. And again, we're trying to interpret where he's coming from, the intention of his of what he's referencing here. But of course, that's fodder for people who perhaps aren't as
Yeah.
well versed in
Yeah.
understanding the
Yeah,
ways in
for
which
sure.
psychology works. But it's problematic primarily because you're dealing with extremes. You go from being, let's say, weak, then to being strong. What we're aiming for is to create some type of balance and harmony, and that means developing an understanding of that, living that out, and fumbling with it as well, which requires humility. The problem with what Peterson said was that it gives oneself over to inflation and to unconscious forces that then lead to tragic scenarios that we've seen, like in the last century, with totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and this gross misuse of power through megalomaniacs. And we don't want that. That's not
Yeah.
healthy for society. It's not healthy for humanity in itself. So, we talked about, we need to get to a place where we can access those feelings, and I would say, as a psychologist, celebrate those feelings. But it comes with vulnerability, it comes with courage, and it comes with a level of sensitivity that perhaps most men might be uncomfortable with exploring because it's unfamiliar.
It seems to me it's going completely opposite way. I mean, literally 100 degrees, 180 degrees, 100 degrees with me all the way.
Yeah.
Being a pilot, I should know that. But my point is he's talking about, you can't be weak. Well, define weak for me.
Right.
What is weak?
Yeah.
And I think in the context in which he's using it, the term weak is completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
He's talking about emotional weakness. Don't let
Yeah.
your guard down. Don't
Yeah.
don't be in touch with your own feelings. And
Yeah.
I think that's absolute insanity. It's
Yeah.
going backwards. I mean, if we want to live in the 17th century and instead of the 21st century, well, maybe that would be the thing to do. But society is going to move forward. Human beings have weathered a lot. This is, believe it or not, um, and I know it's hard to believe, but this is actually the most peaceful time in human history right now that we're living
Yeah.
in. And so we are progressing. We're slow and we regress and things like that. But at the end of the day, we're going to develop more maturity with respect to our emotional ability to communicate to others, our ability to love instead of make war. And I mean, all this kind of talk is hyperbole. It's,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's to bring ratings to Joe Rogan's show or what, but it was offensive to me as a man to hear this is what you need to do in order to survive as a man in this society. It's just very disturbing. And one of my comments in our last episode, one of my concerns was that boys growing up into men, navigating their way into manhood, which we have a podcast about,
Mhm.
hear the term masculinity, toxic masculinity, and toxic in front of the word masculinity makes a pejorative, makes masculinity, excuse me, a pejorative term. Well, while I have a fear about that, I have a whole new fear now to think about is telling young boys and men as they grow up and they're getting in touch with their emotions that this is the wrong thing to do. They should steel themselves. They should build a wall. They should carry emotional weapons
Yeah.
and then learn how to control them. I mean, come on. Uh,
Yeah. The
that's nuts.
negation, it's nuts. And the negation of anything will make it only return even stronger. That from a Jungian point of view, that's a kind of a 101 perspective. We understand that to restrict anything, to resist it, will only not only make it persist, but then intensify even more. We have to come to the realization that yes, there are many men in our society and boys in our society that feel estranged, that feel isolated, alone, that are angry, that feel maybe emotionally and existentially empty. But how are we going to address that? And by
Yeah,
saying, well, don't cry and don't show
yeah,
fear and be self-sufficient,
yeah,
uh, that is not healthy. It's just not because the healthiest of positions is always one that is balanced.
sure.
It always is.
Yeah,
To move further out into the extremes, and it doesn't matter if you're a pacifist or you're more aggressive and bellicose, and you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems as you move further out into the extremes. We have to get back towards honoring and acknowledging where those feelings are coming from. If someone feels disaffected or disillusioned,
yeah,
we have to teach and educate young boys and men on how to communicate and articulate their feelings and
yeah,
embrace the importance of using their emotions as an important part of the ways in which they communicate their identity. And I think they're relational beings in themselves. So
yeah,
there's skill building behind that. You have to
yeah,
identify your emotions. You have to
exactly.
label your emotions. You have to listen.
Sure.
You have to learn how to express your emotions. And if you don't, I think then it creates scenarios like what we're talking about right now.
You know, he seems angry in that clip. And in fact, Jordan Peterson seems angry every time
Yeah.
I hear him speak. But I think that some of this was in the context, or at least the impetus for it was in the context of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to deal with the pronouns and he's frustrated by this and
Yes.
everything.
Yeah.
And, you know, to some extent, I get it from the perspective that human beings are slow to change. Once we've reached a certain age, we don't adapt very well to those kind of fundamental changes.
Right.
But as a person who wants to be sensitive to others, I don't want anybody to suffer. And you know, for me, I would rather err on the side of using pronouns. If somebody, you know, if somebody wants to be called a he or a she, or him or her, you know, what do I care? How does that hurt me in any way? Whereas if somebody's suffering in any even minor way about it, I'm not saying that we don't have bigger problems in the world, and you know that we've got wars going on and children needing fresh water. These are all things that we focus on, and I get it. And so this seems to be trivialized in that context. But I just say, as I live my life personally, I would rather err on the side of considering people's feelings, considering that there are suicidal rates that are very, very high among young people who are troubled by the fact that they don't seem to fit anywhere in society. And if there's a way for us to make them fit, why be angry about that? Why not again, why not open our hearts and extend love and acceptance, which is what you know ultimately we're all looking for, love and acceptance. Why not extend that to them? Where does that giving in any way diminish what we are? Sorry, I'm shaking my monitor here, and I just
Yeah.
realized that everybody's watching me wave back and forth. It's not the winds from the Pacific Ocean here coming into San Francisco. John is not in outer space, but we're
Yeah.
not in our normal
Yeah.
studio.
Yeah.
But you
Well,
know, I could go on about that. I'm not going to, but I think
yeah.
I think I've made my point there is that is that instead of being angry about this, why not take an analytical view of it? Why not do some critical thinking, which we also have a podcast about, and take the data in, move it around it, and see what conclusion you reach. And I think the conclusion you reach is that costs you nothing. It literally costs you nothing to accept this and just say, hey, I may not, I'm not a part of that movement. Maybe I don't fit in that. At the same time, it costs me nothing to say, okay, I accept it. And if you want to call me, I mean, if you want to be called by a different pronoun and you're male, but you identify as female, I could care less. I mean, let's think about the bigger problems in the world and instead extend ourselves to these
Yeah.
people who are suffering, especially the young people that are transitioning through this and feel like they fit nowhere.
Yeah, and I think there's psychology behind this, there's sociology behind it, but I think when a minority perspective or a minority or the other starts to emerge, when there's some type of movement upward, let's say towards a position that requests or desires equality, the position in power, the dominant position, feels threatened,
Yeah,
and through that threat, then sees the minority position or the other as being an enemy of some sorts that could topple whatever semblance of dominance that they feel that they have. So fragile egos are a part of this scenario when we're talking about a reaction to, let's say, the LGBTQ community,
yeah,
who are wanting to be acknowledged and recognized,
yeah,
validated for their position. And then you have the conflict, like you referenced with Peterson, when he was teaching as a professor at his school in Canada. And I think what we're trying to do is to point out and to say, hey, look, we don't have to take this type of position where there's conflict. Why not take a position where we can understand the other? Uh, but I think if the other position, the one that tends to be threatened, that tends to take on maybe positions in which they embrace and embellish their masculinity as something that needs to be dominant, and they cannot appear weak. So they double down, they don't
right,
apologize, they continue to keep inflating the ways in which they are the victims
yeah,
because the other or the minority position is requesting equality.
yeah,
I think we're going to continue to keep seeing these types of scenarios where, unfortunately, there's fighting and
yeah,
there's
yeah,
resistance and more problems occur. So I think that's why the conversation itself we thought was necessary, so that we could say, how do we move out of these trends? And instead of just volleying back and forth from two positions that are fighting against each other, how can we find a middle place that allows us to truly understand where each position is coming from? And as we've talked about before in previous podcasts, of course, we how do I come to know myself? Where do I feel
right,
perhaps insecure, inferior, inadequate? How is that being demonstrated in my behavior? And a
sure,
lot of the times when you see toxic masculinity, it's coming from a position of feeling insecure.
yeah.
Um,
And this, so I don't like the term toxic masculinity, and we've
mhm,
been through that. And at the end of the day, you've acknowledged that
mhm,
it is a pejorative term, and that
mhm.
masculinity and femininity should be both celebrated. And yet, here we face this sort of hatred, this buildup, this bias, fueled by whatever, I'm not sure. Um, and what it does is it just builds a fire for a greater use of that term. And I get it. Like, you know, yeah, at some point, if we're all going to carry around swords and shields and be standing ready to fight all the time, yeah, we're going to have terms like toxic masculinity and probably a lot worse. I guess I guess I'm coming to the point to say maybe I get it a little more now than I did last time. Okay, I still hate the term. I don't like it. Um, but listening to things like that, it's just like, man, that just dilutes whatever the hell I was saying. It's just I just took it hard. I don't want to hear men talking like this, and I don't understand. I actually think religion has a lot to do with it, even though I think Peterson would say he's an atheist, although I've heard him waffle on that. But these religious undertones to all of this, that this stuff is wrong, it's not God's will, and all this is that's all bullshit to me anyway. So I'm
Yeah,
not
it's
I'm
all
not agnostic, and I'm not an even spiritual believer. I'm just an atheist, if that's what somebody wants to call me. I don't believe in Santa Claus, but nobody calls me a name for that. I don't believe in Zeus, and nobody says I'm an atheist because of that. We're just, as Ricky Gervais would say, we're just down to one God, or maybe
yeah.
three or four, and I don't find any evidence for them either. But I do see this everywhere in our social fabric, especially in politics, which of course all this becomes politicized, and then you get these
Yeah.
people up on their podiums and their soap boxes, and spewing this stuff about this isn't what God wanted, as if they know what God would want if there were a God. So this kind of stuff is just all bullshit to me, and it just I get aggravated listening to ignorant people, and I recognize that Peterson is a PhD, and that doesn't mean he's not ignorant. So
Well, I think it's the willingness to be able to see both positions, as we've
yeah,
talked about before, the willingness to see both positions, to acknowledge that perhaps there are elements of misunderstanding. How do we come to a place where we can reconnect and
yeah,
reconcile so that we can move forward from that? I mean, that's what evolution is. We
yeah,
have to adapt to these scenarios as opposed to
right,
bunkering down on each side and then continuing to kind of spew stereotypes and whatever invective that goes back and forth between the two positions. Um, but I think in its essence, you and I have talked about getting to a point where we can see that in order to build up our position, let's say in terms of evolution and
right,
evolving and growing,
right.
um, it comes with a certain level of vulnerability and the willingness to connect. And that caliber of intimacy in novel experience takes courage.
Yeah,
Uh, and I do want to continue to keep emphasizing that because you and I have expressed the importance of finding inroads to emotional intelligence
yeah,
and improving emotional maturity
yeah.
and breaking down wherever we might feel limited in terms of our capacity to express our emotions. I mean, I've worked with I have many male clients, and I have throughout my career. And a majority of the time, the term that we come to is alexithymic, which is not having
God bless you.
words. Yeah, right. That sounds that way, but it is something that we need to come to term. I wish that term would become more well versed in our society because we need to confront it. We just do not have words for our emotions, and if we don't, it stresses our capacities to connect with the people around us. And this isn't just in terms of the opposite sex. We need to understand that it's with our children as well. It's how we parent.
Yeah,
It's how we relate to our spouses and our
sure,
mothers and
sure,
fathers. So
sure.
we need to see this from a more a broader position, and I think a deeper position, so that we can start to plant roots in
Yeah,
emphasizing. And I think when we're talking about masculinity, we're talking about a man who has the ability to reference his feeling states, to articulate his feeling states, and then to use
yeah,
them effectively. That's the key.
yeah,
The problems that we're seeing with toxic masculinity, and this is in the APA, the American Psychological Association has talked about this as well. We need, as clinicians, we need to find a way to address this with our patients,
yeah,
and and so we have to understand that there are wounds there that relate to the people that are demonstrating these unhealthy expressions, and research has shown that it does lead to violence.
yeah,
These types of aggressive positions
yeah.
lead to violence.
Absolutely,
Yeah, and they
absolutely. You
perpetuate,
plant. I'm sorry, I don't mean
sorry, no,
to
they perpetuate
get
these types of societal problems that go throughout generations.
dying to talk here.
Yeah.
Um, because so many things you say, I want to say something about, then I'm
Yeah.
afraid I'll forget them.
Yeah.
But I apologize
No,
if I
no,
interrupted you at
that's
all.
okay.
Well, and I'm not going to harp on Peterson anymore. I'm just
Yeah.
going to say that in this clip that you had sent me, that's sort of lit me off here. He says it not just to young men, but to young women as well. So he's encouraging, he's encouraging the weaponization of our feelings, and to hold those in abeyance for the times that we need to use them. I mean, God awful. This is almost like, so I'm not comparing Peterson
Yeah.
to Hitler. Okay, so I don't want to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jordan, don't come after me to sue me. I didn't say that. But I am going to say that there are parallel lines with Hitler's youth camp, when he was raising all those boys, is to essentially do the same thing, as become as strong as you possibly could emotionally. Strong meaning, which is actually in my terms just the opposite. Strong meaning to guard all of your feelings and to be able to weaponize them as you need to, and to steel yourself against feeling compassion, love, empathy, and all the things that really do make up what a human being should be, not just a man, but for all of humans. So
Yeah.
I'm going to get off but the politicizing of this stuff too. I mean, it's all based on power trips, and I'm more godly like than you, and we've got people who hold Bibles and swear on them, and they don't know what's in them. It's just like the politicians that, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, but it's just like the politicians that talk about the Constitution. They've never read the Constitution. So anyway,
Or the Bible, or
exactly.
any of the texts
Yeah.
that they hold in a photo op in front of a church,
Yeah.
to make themselves, or if they're doing some type of a speech on TV and they have a crucifix in the background or in a kitchen.
Yeah.
These, they're really, it's really unfortunate because I think it diminishes the ways in
Yep.
which we as educated people in our country can see through those types of things and can recognize that they're props.
Yeah.
And that you and I, what we're talking about is depth. We're talking about dimension. We're talking about curiosity. We're talking about moving towards a position of wholeness as opposed to remaining an outlier at the extremes. And I think what we have here is there are certain voices like Peterson who are promoting kind of a crusade against where they feel offended. And I think
Yeah.
it's evident if I don't know if you've seen those some of those clips of him on campus responding to
Yeah.
some of these issues
Yeah.
here. Okay, yeah, and it's again he feel it's evident it seems like he feels attacked,
Oh yeah.
and that if he doesn't conform to what's being requested of him, that in some ways he's being domesticated by the university, and that
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, and that is that's a problem, and so he's fighting, and he doesn't want to appear weak and docile in the face of, let's say, an institution that's requiring something of him. But it goes both ways. I mean, there are plenty of
Yeah.
authoritarian institutions
Yeah.
that have demanded things of us, and of course we feel offended by that as well. But of course, it goes against the basic principles of our country and the democracy that we have, and of course the founding fathers that recognized where we were limited, and I think to some extent recognized the frailties of our psychology, and seeking a savior or a leader who could demonstrate a type of power that saves us or rescues us from our own fragility.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that, we can look at this historically, sociologically. There's many different angles with which we can break this down, Gary. But in its essence, you and I, we continue to keep returning to the importance of love and intimacy and closeness and connection,
Yeah.
and curiosity in our relationships. But all of those things are impossible if you're, of course, exposed to these unfortunate elements in society, most notably that are pejorative towards men.
I'd like to get us a new label like loving masculinity, some sort of something that means quite the opposite of where this type of movement is headed, led by people who have no good intentions really, or I'll say no good intentions. Maybe they think they're good intentions, but
Yeah.
but are completely counter to the types of things that we're talking about. I just got to notice that we're running out of time.
Okay.
And so we're gonna have to end this for now. But I think we might be back with toxic masculinity, and I think we're making some progress here in taking the critical thinking that you and I do, John,
Yeah.
and moving it along. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna turn to our audience now and say, if you enjoyed it today, please do subscribe at The Middle for Men on YouTube. And as well, we'll have podcasts out soon, and soon to be announced on what platform. And we appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate your comments, and we've tried to answer as many as we could. For The Middle, I'm Gary Yeoman.
And I'm John Berardino.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot
Thanks
for
for
coming.
watching.